My child, listen closely. Just moments ago, someone somewhere drew in one last breath, a breath so shallow the machines could barely register it. And before the silence took over that room, before the nurses lowered their heads, that person, weak, trembling, yet strangely peaceful, reached for a pen. Not to scribble nonsense, not to hold on to life, but to sign something sacred. A document that would travel through time and find its way to you. Yes, you. No one else's name was written there, only yours. Not their family, not a partner, not a friend who had shared their life. Only you. And that one decision, written with a shaking hand on a hospital bed, is about to rearrange the map of your destiny. But there's a twist, my child. What they left behind isn't simply an inheritance. It carries a clause, a hidden instruction buried inside lines of legal text that glows brighter than gold yet sharper than a blade. Follow it, and doors you never knew existed will open. Ignore it, and everything you thought was certain could crumble overnight. You may wonder, why me? Who was this person? And why would their final act reach across years and land directly in my life? For you to understand, we must go backward, farther than you expect. Not 10 years, not 20. 46 winters into the past. Because what happened one frozen December night lit the fuse that's still burning beneath your feet today. It was the kind of night when the wind whistled through every crack of every window, when the streetlights looked tired, and the world seemed smaller than usual. A man walked home slowly through the snow, carrying nothing but an envelope and a silence that felt heavier than any weight. That man was your grandfather. He had just lost his job, suddenly, unfairly, brutally. No warning, no reason that made sense. One call from someone in power, and decades of loyalty vanished in a single afternoon. People whispered rumors, cruel and quick. But your grandfather knew the truth. He had discovered something he was never meant to see. Hidden accounts. Missing numbers. The kind of secrets that could collapse an empire if spoken aloud. He had believed honesty would protect him. Instead, it ruined him. The voice behind that phone call, the one that ordered his dismissal, the one that buried his reputation, belonged to the same person who just drew their final breath tonight. Yes, the same hand that destroyed him is the hand that has now written your name in their final will. You see, power has a short memory, but the soul doesn't. For years that person lived as though nothing happened. Wealth grew, influence expanded, the world applauded. Yet every victory echoed with a question they could never silence: what about the man you wronged? 5 years later, life forced them to answer. Their own child fell ill, suddenly, severely, without explanation. Days turned into nights inside hospital corridors filled with the smell of antiseptic and fear. There, sitting beside the fragile life they loved most, they finally understood the pain they had caused. Each beep of the monitor reminded them of your grandfather's heart breaking that winter night. Each doctor's sigh sounded like the echo of his lost job, his silent dignity. And when they prayed, oh yes, they did pray, they whispered a name they hadn't spoken in years: the man I destroyed. Heaven listened. Because heaven always listens. The child survived. But guilt doesn't die that easily. So the person began to change, not publicly, but privately. They gave to charities anonymously. They funded schools in forgotten towns. They smiled more gently, spoke more softly, yet never reached for the one apology that mattered most. Time rolled on. Their health declined. And as their body weakened, the memory of what they had done grew sharper. The night before the end, they could barely breathe, yet insisted the lawyer return to the hospital. I must sign something, they said. There's unfinished business. And with that trembling hand, they wrote one final name, yours. You might think this is about guilt. But guilt alone doesn't cross generations. This, my child, is about restoration. Because when your grandfather lost everything, he did not curse. He looked at his children sleeping and whispered, "Let peace live where bitterness wants to grow." He chose silence over vengeance, kindness over noise. He told the family he quit because he wanted new beginnings, not because he had been betrayed. He protected hearts that didn't yet understand heartbreak. That choice, quiet, unseen, echoed louder in heaven than any courtroom plea. Love covered what hatred tried to stain. And heaven kept the receipt. Now the books are being balanced. The debt from 46 years ago is finding its way home, not through revenge, but through redemption. Inside that envelope waiting for you is a check. But it isn't only currency. It's confession. It's an unspoken "I'm sorry" written in numbers instead of words. And it's bound by a clause more powerful than any contract on earth. It says, "To the one who carries the blood of the man I wronged, this gift will mean nothing until they journey to the place of his rest. Place this letter upon his grave and speak forgiveness aloud. Only then shall what is written become theirs." That is the test. Not a test of obedience, but of freedom. Because forgiveness isn't weakness, it's release. The act that unlocks what anger imprisoned. So now the question is yours: will you go? Will you stand where your grandfather's pain began and close the circle he left open in silence? The answer will decide more than money, it will decide the flow of blessing through your entire line. Because heaven doesn't forget mercy. And the moment forgiveness touches the same ground where injustice was born, everything shifts. What was lost is returned. What was delayed is released. What was broken is rebuilt. My child, hear me, every storm you've survived, every disappointment, every closed door, it all led to this single crossroad. You were chosen not because of luck, but because the same gentleness that lived in your grandfather lives in you. You carry his patience, his quiet courage, his refusal to hate. That's why the clause is written for you. That's why heaven trusted you with the final move in a story that began before you were born. So take the letter. Take the check. Take the trip. And when you stand there, when you feel the wind move through the trees, when the earth beneath you seems to breathe, remember this moment was written long before you existed. Remember that some destinies aren't created, they're remembered. The world will call it coincidence. But heaven calls it completion. When you choose forgiveness, the universe celebrates quietly. Angels record the sound. And somewhere, unseen, a weary soul finally rests in peace knowing the circle is closed. This is your invitation, my child. Not merely to receive what was promised, but to become the bridge between what was wounded and what will now be whole. So stand tall. Go where the clause leads. Because what's waiting for you on the other side isn't just an inheritance, it's transformation. My child, dawn had barely touched the horizon when you felt it, the quiet pull that told you it was time to move. The envelope rested on your table, thin yet heavier than anything you had ever owned. Inside it, the letter and the check seemed to hum with unfinished purpose. You could almost hear your grandfather's name beating between the folds. You packed a small bag and held the envelope for a moment longer, whispering to yourself that this was more than a trip, it was a promise finally kept. Outside, the morning air was damp with mist. The sky glowed faintly pink, and the streets were still half asleep. You started the car, and the engine coughed once before finding its rhythm, like your own heartbeat learning the pace of destiny. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a gray ribbon shimmering under early light. Each mile felt heavier and holier than the last. You thought of your grandfather, the quiet man who smiled through storms, who worked with worn hands and a tender heart. Questions that had slept inside you for years began to stir. Why did he never speak about his last job? Why did certain December nights always leave him silent and distant? The answers hid somewhere along this road, waiting for you. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. The wipers kept time, sweeping away everything that tried to blur your sight. You drove past fields wrapped in fog, past small towns that looked unchanged by decades, until the world around you felt like memory itself. Each raindrop against the windshield sounded like a whisper of the past saying, "Keep going." You didn't realize when you began to speak aloud, telling the empty car that you forgave, that you understood. Somewhere between one town and the next, you found yourself saying, "Grandfather, I'm coming," and a low rumble of thunder answered, distant but clear, as if heaven had heard you and agreed. By evening, you reached the small industrial town where his story had ended. The air smelled of iron and rain, and the streets were narrow, lined with buildings whose paint had peeled like old pages. A flickering streetlight guided you to a modest inn near the river. The woman at the counter looked up when you gave your name. Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. "You're one of Caleb's kin, aren't you?" she asked. When you nodded, she pressed her hand to her heart. "Your grandfather helped my brother when the factory closed. He didn't even know us, yet he made sure my brother found work. People like him don't disappear. They just turn into stories that never fade." You thanked her, feeling tears threaten your voice, and realized his kindness had left footprints here long before you arrived. That night, you couldn't sleep. Rain tapped against the window, and in that rhythm you felt something ancient and alive, like a message beating beneath the noise. You closed your eyes and whispered, "If I'm truly meant to do this, show me." The room fell utterly silent, but peace swept through you like a slow tide. When you finally looked at the clock, it read 2:47 a.m., the number of years since the night your grandfather lost everything. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. You breathed the quiet prayer again and drifted into a sleep that felt more like surrender than rest. Morning came wrapped in fog thick enough to blur the world into softness. You left the inn and stopped at a small cafe to ask for directions. The man behind the counter studied your face for a long moment before speaking. "You remind me of someone," he said. "There was a man named Caleb who used to sit right there every Sunday after church. He talked about hope when nobody else could find any. Are you related?" When you told him you were his grandchild, the man smiled. "Then you come from light. Your grandfather said the best sermons are lived, not spoken." You carried those words with you as you drove toward the hill where the cemetery waited. The path wound upward between wet pines. The farther you walked, the quieter the world became, until even your footsteps sounded like echoes of prayer. At the gate you paused. The air changed, it felt cooler, cleaner, almost alive. You followed the narrow trail until you saw the simple headstone that bore his name. Kneeling, you brushed away damp leaves. The carved letters were worn, but beneath them you read 3 words that stopped your breath: "He chose peace." You unfolded the letter, and the air around you stilled. As you began to read aloud, each word seemed to vibrate through the ground, through your skin, through every unspoken memory between 2 families. By the time you reached the end, your voice trembled. You pressed the letter to the stone and whispered, "He forgave you, and so do I." The wind responded with a sudden gust that circled you once and died in a sigh, as if the earth itself had exhaled relief. A single shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds and landed on the grave. You knew, without explanation, that the clause had been fulfilled. The promise was complete. When you turned to leave, someone was standing at the gate. A man in a dark coat, his eyes cautious yet kind. "Are you related to Mr. Caleb Moore?" he asked. You nodded, still half lost in the silence. He stepped closer and extended his hand. "My name is Daniel Keller," he said. The name struck you like a bell. You had seen it before, at the bottom of the will, beside the signature of the man who had destroyed your grandfather's career. This was his son. Daniel noticed your surprise. "I know who you are," he said gently. "My father told me someone would come one day, someone who would carry forgiveness in their hands. Before he died, he made me promise to be here when that moment arrived." He opened a folder and held it out. He wanted this delivered only after the letter was read at the grave. Inside the folder were several documents and a faded photograph of two men, your grandfather and Edward Keller, standing side by side in front of the factory, smiling like friends who still believed the world was good. There was also a property deed. The address made your pulse quicken, the old house on Oak Ridge Avenue, once the company residence your grandfather had been forced to vacate. Daniel spoke quietly. "My father paid the taxes on that house every year. He said someday it would go back to the right family. It's yours now." You could barely find words. "He finally tried to make it right," you said. Daniel nodded, emotion tightening his voice. He spent his last years wishing he could undo what he did. He believed forgiveness couldn't reach him. But I think, seeing you here, he was wrong. For a long moment neither of you spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the grass. Then Daniel smiled faintly and said, "Maybe both our families get to rest now." You shook his hand, feeling history dissolve between your fingers. You drove to Oak Ridge Avenue as afternoon slipped into gold. The house stood quiet beneath climbing ivy, its windows clouded by dust yet somehow dignified. You opened the creaking gate and stepped inside. The air smelled of rain and old wood. Dust swirled in shafts of sunlight like tiny memories caught in motion. On the mantel rested two photographs, the same ones from the folder, and between them a small handwritten note, for the day when truth and mercy finally meet. You traced the words with your fingertips, whispering, "That day is today." For a moment it felt as though the walls themselves were listening. Later, as dusk thickened, you found another envelope hidden under the desk blotter. The wax seal bore the same initials, E.K., and inside was a short message written in an unsteady hand. It read, "To the one who carries the forgiveness I waited for, I return not just what was lost, but what could have been. The house is yours. Make it a place that heals rather than hurts. Where I once built walls of pride, build doors of compassion. Only then will peace remain." At the bottom, in faded ink, was a verse, "Where sin increased, grace increased all the more." You sat in the quiet room and understood. The inheritance had never been about money. It was about meaning. Both men had been waiting for someone to close the circle. You whispered, "Grandfather," he finally said he was sorry. A gentle breeze moved through the open window though the night outside was still. The house seemed to sigh. You stayed there overnight. Around midnight, unable to sleep, you walked through the rooms by the light of your phone. In the study, an old Bible rested on a shelf, its cover cracked. You opened it without knowing why. A verse had been underlined long ago in your grandfather's handwriting, "Love never fails." Beneath it he had written, "Even when it looks like loss." You closed the book slowly, feeling tears gather and fall. Love had not failed. It had only waited. When you woke, dawn filled the house with golden light. You opened every window, letting air sweep through, carrying away years of dust and sorrow. Outside, dew glittered like scattered diamonds, and for the first time in decades, the place felt alive again. You stood in the doorway, the deed in your hand, and said softly, "This will be a home for others who need new beginnings." The idea felt natural, as if whispered directly into your heart. You imagined a sign one day reading the Oak Ridge Center, for renewal and hope. Maybe this was the reason you were chosen, to turn pain into purpose, history into healing. As you locked the door behind you, your phone rang. It was the lawyer. His voice carried a quiet excitement. "Just wanted to tell you, the funds have been cleared, and an anonymous donor has matched the amount your benefactor left. That doubles your resources for restoration." You smiled, staring at the brightening sky. "Maybe heaven decided to co-sign the project," you said. The lawyer laughed softly. "Whatever it is, it's rare to see justice delivered this beautifully." You ended the call and stood for a while, listening to birds beginning their morning songs. The town, the house, the air, all of it felt different, lighter. You realized you were different too. Forgiveness had broken something open inside you, releasing a piece you didn't know you'd been missing. You whispered, "It's finished." But deep down, you knew it was really a beginning. And as you walked down the path toward your car, sunlight spilling across your shoulders, a single thought filled your heart: some debts are repaid not in money but in mercy, and mercy, once set free, keeps traveling long after the story seems over. You smiled, feeling the unseen world smile back. The morning sun followed you down the narrow road that curved away from the house. Each step felt like exhaling years of borrowed pain. Behind you, the roof caught the light, and for a second the old bricks looked new again, as though they too had been waiting for forgiveness to arrive. You drove slowly toward town, letting the wind roll through the window. It smelled of wet earth and lilacs, and the sound of birds replaced the heavy silence that had hung over everything the day before. You didn't notice until halfway to the cafe that you were smiling for no reason at all. It wasn't joy exactly, it was relief, a deep unclenching somewhere inside your chest. You stopped at the same corner cafe for breakfast. The man who had recognized your grandfather the day before was there, wiping tables. When he saw you, he grinned. "So you found what you were looking for?" he asked. You hesitated, trying to put the impossible into simple words. "I think I found what he was looking for," you said. The man nodded as if he understood. Peace travels in circles. When it leaves one house, it always finds its way home to another. He refilled your cup without asking and walked away humming, leaving you staring at the steam rising from the coffee like a small prayer. You spent the next few days moving between the house and the lawyer's office, signing papers, collecting old keys, sorting through boxes. The work was ordinary, almost boring, yet every small task felt sacred. The house had been empty for decades, but it wasn't dead, it was just waiting for someone to listen. You found receipts from the factory, letters from workers thanking your grandfather for standing up for them, even notes scribbled in margins of ledgers, his handwriting, neat and patient. Each discovery stitched a missing piece back into the story. Every night you left exhausted but content, falling asleep at the inn to the sound of the river sliding past in the dark. On the fourth day you met Daniel again. He came carrying 2 cups of coffee and the tentative awkwardness of someone trying to make peace with a stranger. The two of you sat on the porch steps of the house, the smell of sawdust in the air from the repairs already underway. "He never talked about it," Daniel said after a while. "I knew my father was generous with charities, but I didn't know why. I thought he was just trying to look good in the papers." You looked at him and saw a man carrying both love and disappointment for the same parent. "Maybe he was trying to make something right," you said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Maybe we both are." Over the next week the restoration began to feel like ritual. Painters arrived, carpenters patched the floors, and every plank replaced sounded like a heartbeat returning. You decided that the building would become a shelter for people who had been wronged, workers laid off unfairly, single parents trying to start again, anyone caught between shame and hope. The name came easily, the Oak Ridge Center. When you told the lawyer, he smiled and said, "That will please every soul involved." He promised to help set up the paperwork and offered to volunteer his services until the project stood on its own feet. Word spread quickly through the town. People remembered the kindness of your grandfather and the fall of Edward Keller. They brought stories, old photos, sometimes just quiet gratitude. An old man arrived one afternoon with a framed picture of the factory workers taken decades ago. He pointed at your grandfather in the photo and said, "He made us believe good men still existed." You hung that picture in the hallway where everyone would see it the moment they walked through the door. At night, when the workers left, you would walk through the empty rooms. The smell of paint mixed with the scent of old wood, and the air hummed faintly with electricity from new wiring. Sometimes you thought you heard faint voices. Your grandfather's calm tone, the rougher one that had belonged to Keller, talking somewhere beyond the reach of sound. You didn't feel frightened, you felt accompanied. As if both men were still there, finishing the job through your hands. Daniel came by often. He brought tools, ideas, sometimes just silence. One evening you found him sitting on the porch steps staring at the sunset. "I used to hate this town," he said quietly. "I thought it took my father away from me. But maybe he was just trying to fix what he broke." You nodded, understanding that guilt could travel through blood the way kindness did. "He didn't lose you," you said. "He gave you back to the story." The two of you sat there until the light faded, strangers no longer. By the end of the first month, the Oak Ridge Center opened its doors. The mayor attended, the townspeople came carrying flowers, and a small local paper wrote a story titled, "From Ruin to Renewal." You stood at the entrance holding the ribbon with trembling hands. Daniel cut it, and the crowd clapped softly. Inside, sunlight flooded the freshly painted rooms. On one wall you had written your grandfather's favorite line, "Peace is heavier than revenge." Below it, in smaller letters, another quote you found among Keller's papers, "Restoration begins when truth stops hiding." The two sentences looked at each other like forgiven enemies finally shaking hands. After the ceremony, when everyone left, you walked alone through the rooms again. The echo of footsteps reminded you of how empty they had once been. Now they were full of life, hope, and the faint smell of coffee from the kitchen where volunteers had already begun serving the first guests. You felt no pride, only awe, that all of this could rise from one act of forgiveness. You thought of your grandfather's last prayer, the one he never spoke aloud but lived every day, that peace would outlive him. And now it had. That night, as the town lights flickered on, you drove to the cemetery one last time. The moon hung low, bright enough to turn the grass silver. You stood before the grave, tracing the carved words with your fingers. "It's done," you said softly. "They're both free now." A breeze moved through the trees, lifting your hair, and for an instant the air shimmered as if warmed by invisible hands. You felt no fear, only gratitude. Somewhere beyond sight, something whispered back, "So are you." The following months moved quietly. The shelter filled with people starting over, families rebuilding after layoffs, young workers learning new trades, older ones finding purpose as mentors. Every success felt like a ripple from a stone thrown decades ago. Daniel stayed to help run operations, the townspeople donated supplies. The once abandoned factory nearby was converted into training workshops, funded by an anonymous foundation that seemed to appear whenever resources ran low. You didn't question it. Some gifts don't need explanations. One rainy afternoon, you received a letter with no return address. Inside was a short note written in a neat, unfamiliar hand: "Thank you for setting my father free. He died believing he was unredeemable. Now, wherever he is, I know he's resting." It was signed simply, "A friend." You placed the letter next to the framed photo of your grandfather and smiled. Years later, people would ask how the Oak Ridge Center began. You always told them the same thing, that it started with a mistake, but ended with mercy. That a single decision made in silence, a man choosing forgiveness over revenge, had outlived every lie told about him. You never mentioned the check, or the clauses, or the supernatural moments. Those belonged to the sacred, not the public. What mattered was that peace had found a home. Sometimes, when evening settled and the corridors emptied, you would stand in the doorway and listen to the wind moving through the pines, the same sound you had heard at the grave. It always felt like a benediction. You would close your eyes and imagine your grandfather walking beside you, his hand light on your shoulder, his voice saying what you had come to believe: that love is the only inheritance that multiplies when given away. And in those moments, you knew the story wasn't just about one man's guilt or another man's forgiveness. It was about generations learning to breathe again. About grace outlasting failure. About how the smallest act of mercy can echo through decades until even the stones remember the sound of compassion. That's how the town tells it now, not as tragedy, but as miracle. They say the night the clause was fulfilled, the rain stopped over the hill for the first time in weeks. They say a shaft of light touched the cemetery stone and the river below turned clear by morning. You never confirmed or denied the tale. You only smiled, because you knew truth wears many disguises, and sometimes faith needs a story to carry it. What you do know is this: forgiveness rebuilt more than a house. It rebuilt a name, a family, a future. And somewhere in that unseen ledger kept by time and heaven, the balance finally reads 0.